Well, thank you for joining us. I think you can probably just hear my voice right now, but I'm right next to the computer, and I'm going to do a quick introduction, and then you can take over, Dr. Johnson. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. So thanks first off to my students who you're going to get to meet in a second, but thank you too to the couple of other folks that have been able to join us. I'm delighted. This is our second Aileen Clyde talk, which runs in conjunction with this seminar. I want to thank the Aileen Clyde Foundation for supporting this initiative. For those that don't know, the Clyde family is supporting a larger archiving effort that Marriott Library Special Collections is heading up in order to try to build an archive of 20th century women's history primary sources. It's a pretty exciting endeavor insofar as sometimes women's history seems like it's getting marginalized again, right? That gender history, my own field, is taking over this category. And of course, as Dr. Johnson's book, which we'll talk about in a moment, shows us, we need far more histories of Western women in particular, the Intermountain West, but broadly 20th century women's experience. And so it's to the Clyde Foundation that we owe our thanks for supporting this, but most especially for supporting the archive. I hope those that are interested will Google Aileen Clyde Archive, AILEEN Clyde Archive, and take a look at what's already in there, because it's a pretty great resource for research now and will continue to be so as we build it out. So it's my pleasure, as I've already noted, to introduce our speaker for today, who's Susan Lee Johnson. Professor Johnson is currently the Harry Reid Chair, that's such a cool chair, at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and of course, the current president of the Western History Association. Some folks who are on this call are hopefully in this room know Professor Johnson's excellent first book, Roaring Camp, which won the Bancroft Award among others, and is very much representative of just the very cool work that Professor Johnson does with gender and race, with interdisciplinary approaches, and with intersectional ideas of power. This current new book, Writing Kit Carson, which Professor Johnson will talk to us about today, very much exemplifies that. It was such a pleasure to read, and I can't wait to talk about it more in a couple of minutes after Professor Johnson summarizes parts of it. So with that, it is all yours, Susan.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. I envy you having a course with Professor Basso. I would love to be there every week with you. I don't have a very good setup for giving a talk here, so if I keep looking off here, it's where my text is. We'll see how it works out. But anyway, thank you so much for having me here or there or wherever we are to talk about my book, Writing Kit Carson, and thanks to Matt's students for sitting through such a long and unconventional book. Those of you who've read it know by now that it's not a book about Kit Carson, but rather about how historical figures like Carson fell from mainstream grace in the 20th century, and what that fall had to do with the social movements of the 1960s and 70s, the decline of the Western film genre, the professionalization of Western history as a field, the persistence of amateur historians in that field, and the struggles of women and people of color to find a place in Western history, all seen through the lives of two white women, non-professional historians, who published books about Carson. It's also a book about me. About 10% of the book's 323 pages reveals my relationship to the stories I tell. And that's part of what makes Writing Kit Carson unconventional. It's also a critical dual biography of two obscure figures, Quantrill McClung and Bernice Blackwelder, who wrote about Carson. It probes their connection to him and to Western history more generally. The autobiographical parts of the book probe my connection to these two women, to Carson, and to the West. So even though I didn't set out to write either a biography or an autobiography, when I stumbled on the voluminous correspondence of McClung and Blackwelder at the Denver Public Library over 20 years ago, I ended up doing both, which means I've thought a lot about biography and autobiography over the last 2 decades. And that's where I'm going to focus a lot of my remarks today. From its founding, the discipline of history has had a vexed relationship to biography. Oh, is this going to work? It's not letting me advance the slides.
Oh, darn it.
Oh no. How can that be? I'm trying it with my.
So Dr.
Oh,
Johnson.
there it is. There it is. There it is. I see the little, I see the arrow. Thank you. Okay. So from its founding, the discipline has had a kind of vexed relationship to biography. The vexation has eased somewhat, but as recently as a dozen, I guess it's now 13 years ago, the American Historical Review published a roundtable in which scholars who wrote life histories still felt compelled to challenge old adages about biography as an inferior form of historical writing, even as they promoted new ways of writing about lives. With the old adages still lingering, authors in the AHR Forum showcased a then novel disciplinary practice called the new biography. That is, biographical writing that rejects the notion of a coherent self in favor of a self performed and curated. The forum also promoted a biographical practice that embraces stories of the unknown and the unlettered, not just tales of famous folks who left long paper trails, a staple of the old biography. The roundtable even suggested that one could write the biography of a place, as historian Kate Brown had just done in her then fairly new first book about a living, breathing Ukrainian territory that died by nuclear disaster. I suspect Kate Brown is in great demand right now as an expert who understands, like few others, how a place called Ukraine came into being. But that's beyond my concerns for today. Since the AHR published the 2009 Roundtable on Biography, in the field of North American Western history, scholars have produced profiles of individuals that reflect some of the new approaches promoted there, while others have infused family histories or community histories or movement histories or cultural histories with biographical elements that reflect fresh impulses. I'm thinking of Lorena Oropeza on Reyes Lopez Tijerina, Sherry Smith on Sarah Bard Field and Erskine Scott Wood, May Nye on the Tape family, Kent Blancett on Richard Oakes, Carl Jacobi on William Ellis, Phil Deloria on Mary Sully, Cynthia Orozco on Adela Slos-Vento, Anton Truer on Hole in the Day, Matt Garcia on Cesar Chavez, Brenda Child on her own Ojibwa family, Kathleen Cahill on 6 suffragists of color, and Fred Hoxie on 9 American Indian activists. Meanwhile, another set of scholars has thought critically about the autobiographies that inform the biographies they write. Kate Brown articulated this idea in the AHR Forum when she reflected on her 2004 book, A Biography of No Place, From Ethnic Borderland to Soviet Heartland. In the AHR, Brown revealed that her own youth conditioned her attraction to dystopic places like Chernobyl. She grew up in Elgin, Illinois, home to Elgin Watch Company, which shuttered its factory the year she was born. As Brown puts it, I was able to see stories that had not yet taken shape for other historians because of the sensitivities I acquired in my past. Because of Elgin, she says, I feel drawn to emptied buildings and abandoned streets, that is, to funereal landscapes. While Soviet historian Brown wrote the biography of a place, plenty of US historians have written about their relationship to the stories they tell of human actors. Richard White in Remembering a Hannah Miroslava Chavez Garcia in Migrant Longings, Burl Satter in Family Properties, Saidia Hartman in Lose Your Mother, Kim Tyson in Blood Done Sign My Name, and Alice Eccles in Shortfall. In writing Kit Carson, I followed their lead because I think it's a good and responsible biographical practice. I don't contend that everyone who writes biography, let alone other kinds of histories, should talk explicitly about how their autobiographies inform what they write. But I do contend that we all need to think about the selves that shape what we see and what we say about past selves. In writing Kit Carson, I do the former. My book, as you know, explicitly addresses how my own life informs the life stories I craft of the two white women who wrote about Kit Carson in the 1960s and 70s, and did so at the very moment when frontiersmen like Carson were losing favor, when Western history as a field was professionalizing, and when social movements were fostering revolutions in gender and race relations. The book tells the stories of these two history buffs. Colorado-born Quantrill McClung, who you see here, and Kansas-born Bernice Blackwelder, who you see here with her husband and her dog. Both of these pictures, why do all photographs from the 1970s look like that? They all look a little bit kind of tan or brown or something. They wrote books that featured Kit Carson, the infamous to some and famous to others fur trapper, expedition scout, Union soldier, and US Indian agent. Carson had followed the Santa Fe Trail from Missouri to New Mexico in 1826 and spent much of his life in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. Blackwelder and McClung's work highlighted Carson's marriages to American Indian and Spanish Mexican women at a time when male historians all but ignored Carson's intimate life. McClung and Blackwelder's own intimacies informed their reading of Carson's. McClung never wed, and as a young librarian, she moved in a circle of brainy, rowdy bibliophiles, all white women, some of them Jewish, while Blackwelder, once a singer, married another performer, a Southern white man. The unmarried and queerly single McClung, who published genealogies of the Carson clan and the related Bent and Boggs families, more openly addressed the intimate intercultural bonds that tied the Carson, Bent, and Boggs men to Mexican, Arapaho, and Cheyenne women. The married and more politically conservative Blackwelder, who published a biography of Carson called Great Westerner, struggled more with these bonds and so told a different tale of Carson's intimate ties. First to Singing Grass, who is Northern Arapaho, then to Making Out Road, who is Southern Cheyenne, and finally to Josefa Jaramillo, who is Hispana. In Blackwelder's hands, Carson's serial marriages became a story of racial ascent by association, a tale that climaxed when Carson married into the Jaramillo family, whom Blackwelder cast as affluent Castilians and thus white. Writing Kit Carson also explores McClung and Blackwelder's material circumstances and how those circumstances enabled and disabled the historical work they did. Both were born to middle-class parents, but as adults, Blackwelder and McClung were women of limited means. McClung lived her whole life in Denver. Blackwelder lived briefly in suburban Washington, D.C., and then much longer in Chicago. So both women navigated the era's twinned investment in suburbs and disinvestment in cities. But they grew old in cramped urban apartments, not spacious homes in leafy suburbs. From these city births, both women grew dismayed when activists and academics began to question Carson's legacy in the 1970s. Likewise, writing Kit Carson chronicles my own histories of race and class, of gender and embodiment, and how those histories shape the stories I tell about Blackwelder and McClung's stories about Kit Carson, Josefa Jaramillo, Singing Grass, and Making Out Road. I made myself visible in the book for two reasons. First, I wanted to hold myself accountable. If I subjected McClung and Blackwelder to scrutiny in order to discern why they researched Carson and why they wrote what they wrote about him, I also needed to examine my own investment in their lives, and less directly in Carson's life too. Second, I wanted readers to consider how we know what we know about the past and how that knowing is shaped by the conditions of our knowing. On the surface, the book weaves a story of lives twined across time and space, the 20th century lives of McClung and Blackwelder and the 19th century lives of Carson and his spouses. My own 20th and 21st century life is a strand in that braid too. That's the surface story the book tells. But underneath runs a current of questions about how we know what we know about history, and how what we know is shaped by who we think we are, where and how we live, how we feel ourselves connected to the past, when and why we create knowledge, what we think are the benefits of knowing, whether we think knowing the past can help us or others, whether we think we deserve our lives or perhaps deserve better or worse, why we think we live and love even as others have suffered and died, are suffering and dying still. In writing the book, I wanted to show by intimate quotidian example what's at stake in these questions. So I tried to hold my own life under the same critical microscope I used on Blackwelder and McClung, even as they focused a different lens on Carson, different because it was of another time and place and politics and purpose. Writing Kit Carson, then, is a book written by a 21st century person living a 21st century life while studying 20th century people living 20th century lives as they wrote about a 19th century past. It's a book by a white person about white people who wrote about a white person, an agent of US empire who settled into indigenous and Hispano social worlds to the profound detriment of those worlds. It's a book by a professional historian about the belated professionalization of Western history as a field that didn't create its own professional guild, the Western History Association, until 1962. It's also about the status of amateur historians in the period when academics in the WHA were seizing the reins. Finally, it's a book by a female-bodied but not female-identified person about two self-identified women who wrote about a self-identified man. But it's not, emphatically, a book about identity, not racial or ethnic or tribal identity, not gender identity, not generational identity, not professional identity. It implicitly echoes Richard White's insistence that his Remembering a Hanagran, a book about his mother, doesn't stem, as he puts it, from, and I quote, any interest in my own roots, or God forbid, my identity. I feel the same about questions of identity, especially my own. Instead, writing Kit Carson is a book about identification and disidentification, a critical biography that explores how our identifications and disidentifications with people in the past shape the stories we tell about them in the present. In doing so, it takes up the old question of historical objectivity, using the definition that Joyce Appleby, Lynn Hunt, and Margaret Jacob proposed a quarter century ago. They write, "We have redefined historical objectivity as an interactive relationship between an inquiring subject and an external object." I use that definition to make sense of Blackwelder and McClung, inquiring subjects who studied Carson, external object, thereby crafting a Carson that served both their individual lives and their historical moment. I also use that definition to make sense of myself, inquiring subject, who studied McClung and Blackwelder, thereby crafting their biographies in a manner that served my life and my historical moment. Identification and disidentification. These are among the elements of what Appleby, Hunt, and Jacob call the interactive relationship between subject and object. For biographers, they're the most important elements of that relationship. I contend that we can't think responsibly about the objects of our analysis without acknowledging and interrogating that relationship. Feminist, anti-racist, queer, and BIPOC scholars sometimes refer to this practice as acknowledging one's positionality. And I mean to evoke that helpful way of thinking. But positionality, like the word identity or even subjectivity, if used too casually, is a term that can lend itself to static, fixed representations of both self and other. That's why I focus on identification and disidentification, which are processes, which are relations, flexible processes and malleable relations that shapeshift over time and across space. To show how this works in the book, I want to address one of the central arguments I make there, which is that in writing about Carson, part of what McClung and Blackwelder were doing was trafficking in men. I argue that when Blackwelder and McClung set their sights on Carson, putting him at the center of their published work, as well as the hundreds of letters they wrote to one another, they engaged in a traffic in men. Men in general, and Carson in particular, became for them objects of barter and banter, valued objects that tied them together and linked them to a larger world of publishers, booksellers, librarians, readers, scholars, and history buffs. A traffic in men is an imperfect, here barely conscious, there deeply ironic, and often doomed reversal of that more common and malign set of cultural practices called the traffic in women, whereby women have been objects of exchange in social and cultural systems dominated by men. A traffic in men, by contrast, is more symbolic than real. When women engage in it, it's best understood as a weapon of the weak, an often hidden transcript by which the disempowered ponder and manipulate, and on occasion critique the powerful. In some times and places and among some people, a traffic in men shades into a traffic in things male, whereby the female-bodied appropriate traits and trademarks of manhood. All such gender traffic is infused with power and desire, envy and artistry, longing and privilege, need and want, materiality and imagination. And just as different kinds of trade move along the same roads, so does the traffic in men and things male travel in tandem with racial negotiation, political deal-making, territorial swap, economic transaction, and the give and take of culture. McClung and Blackwelder traversed these crowded highways where men and things male were objects of exchange and Carson was prized cargo. I make the practices I call a traffic in men and things male central in writing Kit Carson, both because they make sense of key aspects of these women's lives and because they make sense of my own. In deploying the notion of a traffic in men and things male, I'm not referring to the contemporary idea of human trafficking that in its United Nations definition refers to, quote, the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other means of coercion, or of the giving and receiving of payment or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Trafficking by this definition refers to historical and contemporary phenomena that have generated wellsprings of necessary resistance. In my work, I use the idea of trafficking less literally, building on the incisive ways that feminists have thought about it in the past. From anarchist Emma Goldman to anthropologist Gail Rubin, 20th century thinkers explicated the idea of a traffic in women, exposing how men, through marriage, prostitution, and heterosexual relations broadly defined, have exchanged women in a manner that has served to consolidate bonds among men. Embedded in this idea is recognition that historically, women's identity has been largely relational, and that women have often lacked clear ownership in their own persons. In the 21st century, though, feminists talk less about the traffic in women, except for those who fight human trafficking, since the female-bodied are overrepresented among the targets of traffickers the world over. The ebb of traffic in women talk in part reflects the positive changes feminism ushered in across the last century. But the category women also grew notoriously unstable by the end of that century, as feminist and queer theorists repudiated binary notions of gender that split humanity into two distinct, dichotomous, and self-evident classes, women and men. As the categories came apart, ideas that depended on them, like the traffic in women, started to seem old school. So my choice to advance the idea of a traffic in men is a bit of a throwback. But what it throws back to is an original feminist insight into how gender difference has been arranged, not just as opposition, but also as hierarchy. Social worlds have been organized as if the categories women and men are real, discrete, and inevitably and hierarchically wed, as in man and wife. In social worlds that take men and women for granted and that grant men more power than women, women have learned to cope. McClung and Blackwelder lived in such a world. I was born into such a world as well. I argue that one of the ways people identified as women who live in such worlds cope is by trafficking in men and things male. While progressives nowadays tend to frame discussions of masculinity as conversations about gender identity, I'm interested in the broader ways that people called women have handled and made use of men and male gender. The idea of a traffic in men and things male then honors 20th century feminists, even as it belongs to our century. I don't argue that Blackwelder and McClung's traffic in men was radical. It didn't upend racial and gender hierarchies. But it did inch understandings of men like Carson toward reevaluation. And it does reveal the gender and racial hierarchies that define those women's lives. I came to this conclusion as I read the letters McClung and Blackwelder wrote to each other from the 1950s to the 1980s, as they swapped research on and ideas about Carson specifically and Western history broadly. McClung, the retired librarian, saved their correspondence and donated it to the Denver Public Library, her former workplace, when she died. In those letters, men were symbolic objects of exchange, a kind of intellectual property, a patrimony, if you will, that they traded back and forth. And if McClung and Blackwelder saw value in men and things male, they often devalued women and things female, not least through their habit of identifying themselves respectively as an old maid and a housewife. Trafficking in men and things male isn't a universal practice. It's a historically specific set of habits that reflects configurations of power in distinct contexts. It has often been circumscribed by the relative disempowerment of some self-identified men by other self-identified men and their womenfolk, which has also restricted the extent to which self-identified women have engaged in it. That is to say that when the men whom women embrace as brothers or friends or fathers or lovers have themselves been subjected to routine humiliation or violence or exploitation, limiting or even eliminating the ability of those men to enact male dominance, or when men themselves have rejected the terms of male dominance, then the traffic in men and things male takes on different forms and meanings, or even ceases to be a needful, efficacious set of practices. In the lives of McClung and Blackwelder, however, a traffic in men and things male was necessary and effective, and they took it up with a vengeance. Carson, his compadres, and Western men generally were the chief objects in this trade, and it was Blackwelder and McClung's work on these mostly white men that gave the women whatever stature they enjoyed as chroniclers of the Western past. Had they centered their research instead on Singing Grass or Josefa Jaramillo, their work wouldn't have gained much notice. It may not have been published. Simply put, in the mid-20th century, white men were the heroes of the frontier story, and trading on the over-identification of things Western and things white and male brought rewards. The rewards were limited for non-professional women historians working in a professionalizing male-dominated field like Western history, but rewards there were. What does all of this have to do with me as writer of Writing Kit Carson? In the parts of the book that chronicle my relationship to McClung and Blackwelder's work on Carson, I address how I, as I came of age in the 1960s and 70s, thought about the West as a male place, starting with my childhood love of the television series, The Rifleman, a domestic Western set in an impossibly white New Mexico. The Rifleman's hero, the handsome widower played by Chuck Connors, carried a very big gun everywhere and cared for a winsome son, played by Johnny Crawford, a former Musketeer. I adored that boy. I wanted to be him. As I grew up, of course, I learned to be critical, intensely critical of the over-identification of things Western and things white and male. But I won't deny my early sense that the West was a space where I, as a gender dysphoric Midwesterner, might remake myself. And I can't entirely disavow it, even now. The tension between adult critique and youthful identification is at the heart of writing Kit Carson. As I explain in the book's final paragraphs, I grew up as a student of manhood and womanhood, so uncomfortable in the skin of my assigned gender that it became an itch that I couldn't help but scratch. I took stock of how various kinds of men enacted and insisted upon their masculinity, as well as how various kinds of women affirmed or disparaged, welcomed or walked away from that enactment, that insistence. No surprise then that when I stumbled upon a 25-year correspondence between two 20th century white women who were transfixed by a 19th century white Westering man, that I wanted to make sense of the dynamic that drew those women to that man and thus to one another. And I wanted to understand how this dynamic was nestled within their quotidian lives. Hence my presence in a critical biography of a biographer and a genealogist who wrote books about an iconic frontiersman. I don't know if the story I tell in Writing Kit Carson achieves its goal of accountability to past and present, to academic and amateur historians, to white people and people of color and tribal peoples, to women and men and the rest of us, to straight folks and my rainbow nation. But I do know that it was worth a try. And that's where I'll stop.
That was such a good summary, since I only told you a couple of days ago that, would you mind doing a 30-minute summary?
Yeah.
That was fantastic. That was fabulous. So I'm going to open it up to my crowd for questions. And I think anyone online, obviously, that's a couple of folks here who wants to ask a question, just holler out or do the hand wavy thing or whatever. So I've got plenty, but does anybody in my crowd here have a question to start us with? Julie does, who might, let me see if I need to, are you, okay, so my students tell me how to do this each time. I'm gonna mute this speaker, I think.
Or just on your computer.
Uh-huh, okay, here I go. Okay.
Okay, no, you're still muted.
Yeah, so I'm muted, but this one up here isn't muted.
Otherwise the feedback.
Yeah, so which speaker do you want me to turn off? This one, right?
Oh, wait.
That's what I'm trying to tell you. It's going to the TV.
So this echoes too much.
Oh, yeah, that's a nice echo.
So Julie, you might have to just,
Talk. Can you hear me, Dr. Johnson?
I can. Let me turn up my volume.
so that's the problem because it's coming through this thing.
Oh, my God.
Okay. Hi. There was like a path of chairs that was in my way as well.
Okay.
So my question
Oh, do
is,
you mind introducing yourself and maybe, I don't know, just saying just a sentence about yourself so I know who I'm talking to?
oh, thanks. Yeah. My name is Julie Huddleston. I'm a second year PhD student and I study women's history in the United States in the 20th century and
Perfect.
21st, I don't know.
Yeah.
So my question, I used to work as an archivist before I started grad school. And so I love kind of that meta narrative that's going on throughout and like imagining your experience in the archives, because I've had that experience with collections that I'm like obsessed with a person where I'm like, who are you? You're so wonderful. And they're just a normal, mundane woman, you know,
Right.
who didn't do anything important. And so McClung and Blackwelder really resonated in that way. And I loved it so much. And then one thing that I was wondering about with the fact that McClung did donate her personal papers to the library, that seemed so weird and dissonant to me, because it seems like in the 80s, women were still devaluing what historical contributions they had in their personal lives, you know, thinking like, it makes sense that McClung donated her research, saying like, here's what I know about Kit Carson, this very important man. But so it's really striking to me that she donates her personal letters, because it seems like most people would pass by and say, who's McClung? Like she doesn't matter, you know?
Right.
Do you have any sense of why she donated her personal papers? That's like such a weird disconnect to me, because she clearly must have thought something about personal self if she did that, like just the valuation of that she mattered historically. I don't know.
She had a very strong sense of herself. And I have, met some people who are now like my age, who are very young, and who worked at the Denver Public Library with her, actually not when she was an employee, but she worked there for years after she retired. She did research there. And everyone has, I never met her. I could have, we overlapped by, I don't know, 3 decades before she died, or 25 years. But everyone I've talked to have met her, just have described her as a person who had a very strong sense of self and of her own talents and importance. She was a very small woman, but people said she always wore these shoes, a heel with a kind of a thick heel that made a really loud noise when she walked in, and people would say they could hear her coming, this small woman with this very determined step. And I think I mean, I don't know why exactly, except that, she came of age at a time when, possibilities were really opening up for women. And she was self-trained as a genealogist. She was a librarian and just became a genealogical librarian. And she valued her own talents. So when it came, I think she always knew she would save her research materials and hoped that the Denver Public Library would take them. I never found any documentation of why and exactly when she gave her personal papers, because she left those to what is now History Colorado, used to be the Colorado Historical Society. But it was very telling to me that she separated the two parts of the collection and, put the research papers of the Denver Public Library, and her personal papers were really about her sort of youth and young adulthood. They kind of drop off in the 1930s. you know, she had a pretty rowdy, for librarians, a pretty rowdy social group. They had a lot of fun. And, you know, the fact that she created for herself in those years, in the teens and 20s and 30s, 9 scrapbooks that she created where she would take old books that were, you know, deaccessioned at the library and paste her own stuff into those books. And then that she saved all of that and donated it. So I'm not sure I can answer specifically because you know, I never saw a note from her or anything that would tell me exactly what she was thinking. But she clearly had a very strong sense of herself and valued her own talents and abilities. And I also think it's telling that she split the two parts of her, you know, her materials and put them in two different places. The only exception to that is that the letters she exchanged with Bernice Blackwelder ended up with her research papers. And I think she saw those as kind of part of her research on Carson. But of course, there's a lot of really interesting, especially as the two women became better and better friends. There's a lot of interesting and kind of maybe not as juicy as her younger stuff, but yeah, that is pretty revealing. And then you put those two collections back together, and it's very, very rich.
Yeah, yeah, she's great. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so Lisa, I don't know if I'm going to end up with the echo thing again. You might have to come around here and ask it. Sorry, as always, to everyone for my technical inabilities. I will not be leaving my Zoom papers to anyone. You know, Matt's Zoom tricks will not be part of any archive. Yeah, do you want to come on over? So you might, oh, I see, okay.
I just,
All right.
I don't want to mess up my definition.
Hi, thank you.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, yes. Where am I looking?
Right there, at the
Right.
green dot.
At the green dot. Okay.
Oh, interesting. I see you in two places from two different angles.
Oh dear. I really need my chin lift right now, but I'm Lisa McBolin, and I'm getting my master's. I teach high school down just about an hour south of here.
Great, great.
So a few years ago, I took a class where we went and collected stories of women from Utah who had made a contribution to Utah's history. And I chose to write on Juanita Brooks. And so I interviewed her biographer and I interviewed her daughter. And it was a class on reflexive ethnography. And as I read your work, so I just brought up a definition of reflexive ethnography, where you focus on the personal experiences and perspectives of the author and how that informs the writing. But my professor took it further and said, not only does it inform the writing, that relationship that you establish with the subject actually changes you, the writer. So would it be fair to say that in writing Kit Carson, that it changed you in addition to, I mean, so you examined these women and Kit Carson through your own perspective, but would you go so far as to say that it changed you when you established a relationship with the two women?
Wow, what a great question. And I mean, my short answer is yes, but to the long answer, man, no one's ever asked me that question. I mean, it's certainly changed the kind of historian I am. I had written a kind of social history of gender and race relations in the California Gold Rush. I had never paid so much attention to lives. You know, when you write a social history or a cultural history and it's about a lot of people in a place, you kind of, I don't know, cherry pick, like incidents that illustrate arguments you're trying to make. When you write about individuals, and you you know, when you're writing a social or cultural history that's focused on a particular time period, they're just these snapshots of people's lives, and you often don't know, you know, what came before, what came after. So examining whole lives and then taking so long to do it. This book took me 20 years. I know I grew old over the time period. And you know, I identified with them at different points of their lives as my own life was changing. I mean, I do think I've always been, not always, but as a scholar, as an adult scholar, or tried to be self-critical of who I am and where I come from and how that influences, you know, how I think about the past. But I feel like this forced me to be much more honest and open, and I don't know, just more self-critical. I mean, you know, a critique of this would be, well, it's just navel gazing, and it is to a certain extent, but I think it's navel gazing with a purpose, because I think all of us can benefit from being self-critical about the work we do and thinking about what we bring to the table, and you know, what another scholar studying the same thing might see that we might not see. I don't know if that helps me. It reminds me actually that the anthropologist Sylvia Rodriguez was one of the people who wrote a blurb on the back of the book. And I think she referred to this as a reflexive biography. So she's clearly drawing on, you know, how anthropologists think about this. But thank you for that question. I mean, do you, I don't know what, I don't know. Does that answer your question, or do you have more thoughts about it, or?
I wanted to hear your opinion because I've had to examine my life. It wasn't a huge book on Juanita Brooks, but I would really like to meet her, I guess, after studying her life, and I would like to meet her and talk with her.
Yeah.
So I'd like to be a historian like she is. I mean, was, but
yeah.
So I just thought I'd ask.
Right. And she's such a great example of someone who, you know, is, I think, more than these women, kind of closer to the realms of academic power. Not that she, you know, was able to grab onto all of that, but these women were a little more distant from that world than she was. But yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
So in our rotating chairs now, Gary has a question. Do you want to come up?
Yeah.
Okay. Is this the first time you've ever had people come up to talk to you on a virtual lecture?
Yes, I think so. We're always having new experiences on Zoom.
Hi, Dr. Johnson. My name's Gary McElpring. I'm a second-year master's student here at the U, studying American history. I just broke my mask. I don't need it because I'm talking to a computer now. So
I feel like I should put my mask on in solidarity, but I'm alone here and I have an air purifier in my office, so I think I'm safe.
I had a question about the structure and organization. The structure and organization of your book, and you sort of playfully exposited on it a little bit ago when you said you're a 21st century person writing about 20th century women who were writing about a 19th century man, and you're also writing about yourself,
right.
And peripherally or tangentially you're kind of writing about Kit Carson too.
Right.
I mean, it's a very complex book.
Yeah.
And I was so impressed with the organization and the way you presented the information. It flowed so naturally that it just kind of seamless from point to point. And I was wondering, as you set about writing it, as you gathered your material and put pen to paper, as it were, Did you already have the organization in mind, or did it evolve as you wrote? I just couldn't help wondering that as I read it, because it's
Yeah.
such a complicated story.
Yeah. Well, so when I first found the correspondence between these two women, I had just finished my first book. I think it wasn't out yet, it was in press. And I found this correspondence, but I should back up a little. I thought I was going to do a 19th century project that would in part focus on Kit Carson's intercultural, interethnic, interracial relationships as a kind of window on the transformation of what became the Southwest in the 19th century. And I thought, and I knew that this Quantrell McClung had published these genealogies, and I thought, and I thought, well, somehow I figured out that her research materials were at the Denver Public Library, and I thought, well, maybe she would have found something that it might take me longer to find on my own. So I'll go through her research papers and see if it leads me to any primary sources that I might not have found so readily on my own. And it didn't. It was a huge collection, but nothing like that jumped out at me. But what did jump out at me was this correspondence with this other woman, this 25-year correspondence over 300 letters. And having just finished a book, I was like, oh, this would make a nice little article. This would be a fun little article. And, I was a 19th century historian, and, I just thought this would be, just a task I could actually complete in, a year or two. Well, I actually wrote that article and I never published it. I gave talks out of it, but I just realized it left so many questions unanswered. And it really just focused on these women's lives in, the correspondence went from the 1950s to the 1980s. So I met them as sort of, I will be honest, my idea was that these were little old lady historians, and they were kind of interesting, but kind of quaint. And I wrote this article and it was so unsatisfying. There were so many unanswered questions. And then I decided, well, I'll just write a little book about them. And I did decide early on, well, and then I started looking for more stuff. And, I found Quantrell McClung's, youthful papers. Then I found that, Bernice Blackwelder didn't leave her stuff anywhere, but I discovered that her favorite niece was still alive. And I started corresponding with her. And I slowly started to learn their backstory. There were references in the letters to Bernice Blackwelder having been a singer, to, Quantrell McClung as a young librarian, but I didn't really have a sense of who these women were. And, so I kept doing the research, and for a while, I thought it would be a little book, and then it just grew and it became the little big book. But I did kind of want to introduce the reader to these women the way I met them, sort of from the 1950s to the 1980s, and kind of withhold the backstory until I had, because I don't know, one of my readers said, oh, I don't think you should do that. I think you should really, switch it back and put their early, and I was like, who wants to read about these women's lives if you don't know what they did later? So I decided to start with them in the 1950s and 60s, and then the 60s and 70s, and then dial back and talk about their how their growing up years and their kind of coming of age in Western places shaped the historians they became, and then circle back around to the very last years of their lives. So, that's another thing that makes the book unconventional. As I explain, I think in the prologue, novelists do this a lot. They'll tell a story backwards, or kind of tell part of a story and then dial back, but historians don't often do that, and I wanted to experiment with it. One thing, when you get tenure, if you get a tenure track job and you get tenure, it's like, I can try anything. They can't fire me. What I didn't understand though is one, I was a 19th century historian and I suddenly had to learn so much about the 20th century. And also that writing about individual lives it's hard. The details in some ways don't matter, but they do matter and you have to get them right. And so it's a kind of research that is just kind of almost endless. I do think I'm not sure if I'd taken another 5 years if I would have found anything else. I did think I did find everything that was available about including people to talk to who knew them. But finding all that stuff, took a lot of time. And then developing the context. I remember telling someone that I felt like about every 10 or 15 pages, I was learning a new historiography because I had to put, I knew nothing about live performance in the 1920s and 30s or about music unions or, so I was always like stopping, had a bunch of stuff to write about and realizing I don't know the larger story. So then I had to stop and look at a bunch of secondary stuff and put it in context. But anyway, that's a really long answer. I don't think, it deciding to put, to hold their young lives, their childhood and young adulthood, that came pretty early, but not right at the beginning. Yeah.
Well, I think you did it magnificently. I mean,
Thank you.
it was such a good read. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The rotating cast continues. Other questions from my group here? I'm going to steal a question then. Well, they think about it. I love the section about and the conceptual ideas around a traffic in men. And was delighted that you decided to kind of talk a little bit about that in your presentation and your reference to weapons of the week, right? But I want to ask about weapons of the week, right? Is there the possibility of having women who traffic in men or maleness, who I'm thinking of women with power, right? I want to say conservative, but I almost feel that's unfair. Kind of a bias on my own part that I'm going to say, okay, conservative women have this kind of power. And of course, I'm such the 20th century historian and 21st century historian that I'm thinking of contemporary examples.
Right.
But I'm also thinking of like examples from other places, that I'm fixated on, like New Zealand, and kind of battles between women, both groups trafficking in men, as you explain it, right? I mean, I really liked the concept. So there's a question there, but it's really about weapons of the week and whether that always sits next to a traffic in men or not necessarily.
Yeah, I don't think necessarily. I think in this historical circumstance with this women in the field of Western history, it works.
Yeah.
Because they were profoundly disempowered, even vis-a-vis other amateur Western historians who were mostly men. I mean, they couldn't join the Westerners. They could join the Western History Association, but they didn't really have the resources to, get involved in it. So that's why I, and I sort of went over some of that today, say this is a very historically specific. I mean, the other thing I think about the traffic in men, like, I shouldn't do this because I'm kind of undercutting myself. I've often thought that it's somewhere that the notion of a traffic in men is somewhere between a historical argument and a cheap party trick. That it is partly it's a kind of finger in your eye kind of thing. Like, we've been talking about the trafficking in women all these years. So let's let's turn the tables here. But you can't just turn the tables in a circumstance where, women are disempowered vis-a-vis the men in their lives. And so it isn't just a reversal. It's to the extent it is a reversal, it's often a failed reversal. And it's not, as I say, it's not necessarily radical. I mean, I think maybe even in the 21st century, most female-bodied people who have been around people who identify as women know traffic in men when they see it. There are things that women will say about men when men aren't around or under their breath, whether it's about husbands or bosses or senior colleagues or what have you. But saying those things doesn't necessarily change anything. It might if you say those things to one another enough that you get pissed off enough that you create a social movement. It can become transformative, but it's not necessarily transformative. It can just be a way of coping. But I do think, and in circumstances of, enslaved men or exploited working men or queer men, there are so many circumstances where this way of thinking doesn't work or doesn't apply or applies in such a different way. But I just decided to kind of throw it out there because I do think it fits this historical circumstance and these women. And then people can kind of do with it what they will.
I think it's a really, it forces you to think about the context and the people that you're talking about and how power sits with them,
right.
Or doesn't, or whatever, in ways that I think are just wonderfully generative, right? It's really interesting to think, okay, so what's going on here? Do they have any power? Is this thing that we're talking about, traffic in men, happening or not happening? What
right.
exactly? So it's, I don't know. I liked it. I thought it was really cool to kind of think next to, and to use. Okay, other questions from my crew? I still have one more then. I have a 19th century question.
Okay.
Because I'm not a 19th century person, but in reading how you talk about what these two women might have suggested, albeit for a Cold War reason, potentially, right? About pioneer, it's going to be about masculinity, about pioneer masculinity. I don't know. It kind of felt like a really potentially different image of pioneer masculinity, one that was deeply family centered,
right?
In a way that I'm writing about this for New Zealand, but in New Zealand they call it the man alone.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a veiled image, right? That's for the public, as you note, whether it's through Westerns or whatever. But there's kind of a huge desire for family,
right.
And family kind of as an operational system and a labor system and all that sort of stuff. But as you thought about these various pioneer men, I was thinking about the George Thompson section. I don't know if you remember, there's like this Thompson family or Thomas or Thompson family, and he takes in all these other family members,
right?
Right?
Right.
It's just like this incredible, like weird moment where it's like,
right.
He's like, nope, I'll help you too. I'll help you too. I'll help you.
Right.
I don't want to make him a hero.
Right.
But I do think it feels like it centers a different notion of pioneer masculinity, maybe.
Absolutely. And it shows these men to be deeply connected to people around them. I think, Quantrill McClung was, she was writing a genealogy. And so by definition, she's all about connections, certain kinds of connections. They have to take place through, blood or marriage. But, Blackwelder, her biography, and she knew this, she said it, and it is true that in 1962, it's not that no other biography had noted who Carson was married to, but no one had made as much of those ties as Blackwelder did. I mean, because she was writing a biography, she created a storyline in a way that a genealogist has a harder time doing. But both of them centered those connections, and I think, as I said, they domesticated Carson and men like him. The problem was, Carson didn't just need to be domesticated, he needed to be disciplined, and it really came from the critiques of activists and academics who looked at his participation in the Navajo Long Walk and other aspects of his life. That's where the disciplining came in. Not to say, I mean, he is a complicated character. He's not Custer, he's not Chivington. He's complicated, but yeah.
He's also what I like to call the perfect height. Just making an observation, has nothing to do with me or anyone else I know, but I think he really hit the sweet spot on height. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I think it's in a footnote. I didn't put it in the text, but so you may not have seen it, but I relate in a footnote a moment when I think it was when I still thought I was doing the 19th century project, and I was in Taos looking, I think I was at the, it's now the Southwest Research Center, but then it was something else, and they have all these Carson papers, and I was just starting on this, and there were different people in the archive, and I was talking to local folks, and I mentioned just in passing that, it was my understanding that Josefa Jaramillo was taller than Kit Carson. And oh boy, did I hit a nerve. And I thought this was kind of common knowledge. And I've since had to do a fair amount of research to determine that, yes, I think that was true. But, someone said to me, well, we've measured his clothes and her clothes, and that's not really the case. And then finally he just said, he was big enough.
Oh my God.
Right. I was trying to figure out if there was a way to title the book that, but it didn't quite work. Big enough.
Just plain big enough, right?
Right.
Okay, so last call, if anyone else. All right, we're gonna let you go, Susan.
Okay.
Thank you so
Great.
much
right.
for visiting with us. These students aren't going anyway, because now we're going to talk about the Cold War and gender and so on. So we're going to be talking a lot more about the book, which I'm excited to do. But thanks for taking the time.
Yeah,
Seriously.
thank you. It's really been fun, and I hope you all come to the WHA in San Antonio next fall, and please come and introduce yourself. Who knows if we'll be in masks or not, but it was really great to meet all of you.
We'll look forward to seeing you in person in San Antonio. That'll be so much fun. That'll be
All
great.
right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks. Bye-bye.